When you think of mythology in Victorian art, you probably think of the nude water nymphs of John William Waterhouse, and as we saw last week, his work draws heavily from myth and legend for its subject matter. Yet he was nowhere near being the only artist inspired by classical stories. Evelyn De Morgan was another artist, although her work has never been as widely discussed or appreciated as that of her male counterparts. Indeed, it's only been a relatively recent resurgence of interest that has seen her work shared more widely. So let's explore the link between mythology and art within De Morgan's work in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are cracking on with our July theme of folklore, mythology and art. Last week we did have a look at John William Waterhouse and it ended up being a bit of a bumper episode, and this one hopefully will be a little bit shorter. Like I did last week though, if you do want to see the artworks as I'm talking about them, you can see the images on the blog post, which is linked in the show notes below, or you can also view them in the video, which is basically like the audio visual version of this episode, so the images will show up on screen on YouTube. So I've put the link for that below as well. And again, just as a reminder, in case you didn't hear the episode last week, I know that the Victorians have a lot to answer for quite widely, but there is a reason why I've chosen Victorian art for the theme for this month, and it's essentially because it was a period in which mythology and folklore appeared a lot in the art. And yes, they did use these myths to explore female sexuality and to reinforce patriarchal and colonial ideals, but these paintings did also bring the legends and myths to a wider audience. And like I said last week, on a practical level, many of the paintings are in the public domain, so I can use them. So without any further ado, because I don't want to have a massive great intro like I did last week, let's crack on and have a look at the mythology in the art of Evelyn De Morgan. So who is Evelyn De Morgan, I hear you ask, and it is quite sad that that would actually be a question that a lot of people would ask, because she is nowhere near as famous as some of her male counterparts, despite the fact that she is clearly far more talented. She is also one of my favourite artists, so I am slightly biased. Now, she was actually born Mary Evelyn Pickering on the 30th of August 1855 in London, and her uncle was the artist John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, who was often considered a latter generation pre-Raphaelite. She was home educated, as women of her time would have been, but she did study a range of languages, including Latin and Greek, and she studied mythology, classical literature, history and science, because her mother believed that she should enjoy the same education as her brother. And this sort of thinking perhaps explains why some scholars see feminist themes in her work. It does also help that she boycotted the Royal Academy and signed the Declaration in favour of women's suffrage in 1889, but we do see a little bit of kickback against otherwise conservative ideals. Indeed, when she started her art training in 1872 at the Royal College of Art, she was basically going against her parents' wishes, because they said that they wanted a daughter, not an artist, and she essentially went, I don't care, and went off to do it anyway. So she's pretty awesome like that. She did move to the Slade School of Art in 1873 after they started accepting women, and she first exhibited her work in 1876. And in 1887, she married William De Morgan, a noted ceramicist. And interestingly, Evelyn actually bankrolled William's pottery work with the money raised through selling her work, which in some ways does make them quite an interesting couple, because they were very much like a power couple in terms of art and design, but they didn't necessarily follow the same sort of traditional marital norms, as it were, of the time. Indeed, I actually saw an exhibition of their work way back in March 2020, and it was literally like a week before lockdown 1 started, so I was really glad I went to see it, and it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, William's work is awesome, but Evelyn's is just absolutely stunning to see it in person. Interestingly, the couple were actually spiritualists as well, which also appears as a theme throughout Evelyn's work. And in 1909, the De Morgans actually published the results of an experiment, which is the title of the book, anonymously, because they actually used to do automatic writing sessions together, which is a popular spiritualist technique for contacting the dead, and they gathered and edited sections of that to put it in this book. Now, De Morgan exhibited regularly until 1907, and in 1907 William's career as an author took off, and Evelyn no longer needed to support him with sales of her work. This partially explains why her paintings became more personal and related to symbolism, since she didn't need to create commercial work. And as Elise Lawton Smith points out, the artistic landscape also changed in 1910 with the first exhibition of post-impressionist art in London, and many of the original pre-Raphaelites had already died by this point, with art styles across Europe changing. De Morgan, meanwhile, seemed more interested in her spiritual beliefs, and she was also a committed pacifist and died on the 2nd of May 1919. Now, we can largely divide De Morgan's paintings into three broad categories: mythology, spiritualist themes, and war, and this post is going to focus on her mythological themes for obvious reasons. Now, the first painting that we're going to have a look at is The Angel of Death from 1880, and in this painting, De Morgan visualises death as a woman. It's quite a soft painting, and it's actually a rather gentle image. The woman who's basically being received by the Grim Reaper doesn't exactly seem particularly sad or worried about what's happening, and death also has this much more approachable feel as well. And in fact, death is almost viewed as a blessing here, and this is hardly surprising because De Morgan saw death as a transition rather than an ending, which also explains the composition with the reclining human reflected in that leaning angelic figure. Such an attitude comes from her interest in spiritualism, and she did keep her practice private because of the accusations of fraud within the public displays. Instead, she and her husband practiced automatic writing together at home. As Judy Oberhausen notes, and I quote, "Many of those Victorian intellectuals who were interested in spiritualism may have experimented with automatic writing because they felt it could be an aid to their creativity," end quote. Clearly this would work quite well with a creative couple like the De Morgans. And spiritualism does appear within Evelyn's paintings in both subtle and overt ways. For many at the time, and I quote, "spiritualist philosophy is often conflated with a particularly charged recognition of the claustrophobic world of middle-class Victorian and Edwardian women," end quote, and that's by Smith. This reflects a tendency for women to seek their fortune as a medium, one of the few roles where they were prized rather than rejected. And bearing in mind the idea that Evelyn's parents didn't want her to become an artist, she would have well felt that claustrophobic nature of being a middle-class Victorian woman. The other thing I like about this painting is the way that it takes a completely different approach to the Death and the Maiden images that you get, particularly from the 15th century onwards, where you essentially have a woman who's often naked and quite nubile being embraced by the Grim Reaper, and in many of the images you can tell that the woman is not at all happy about this, and it is essentially a conflation of the death drive and the sex drive, essentially. So this idea of Thanatos, which is dead, and Eros, which is love, coming together in this one image. Whereas in De Morgan's version, she's stripped all that away and she's just literally left behind the moment that death comes to claim someone, but that it's a welcome visitation rather than anything that's weirdly erotically charged, or indeed obviously a moment of sadness. Instead, De Morgan has painted it as quite a pleasant image, if that is the right word to use. Now we are going to go on to another one of her images which also marks a point of death but in a much less positive way, and that is Clytie from 1886 to 1887. Now Clytie was an Oceanid or water nymph, daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, and she loved the sun god Helios. Now Helios abandoned her for Leucotho, who was a Nereid, which is another type of water nymph. Remember, there is a blog post about the 3 types of water nymphs if you are interested. Furious about this betrayal, Clytie then told Leucotho's father about the relationship between Leucotho and Helios. Now obviously Leucotho's father was not particularly happy to hear about this either, and he had Leucotho executed for her relations with Helios. So again, the woman's being blamed for something that she's done with the man, and he gets off scot-free. But never mind. This action didn't exactly enamour Helios towards Clytie, and where she had hoped that it would essentially win him back, instead it just pushed him further away. And Helios resolved to ignore her. Clytie clearly wondered how she was going to win him back, so she chose to sit naked on the rocks for 9 days, refusing food and drink, watching Helios's progress across the sky. Still, Helios ignored her, and after 9 days, Clytie turned into a turnsoul, also known as a heliotrope. Newer versions of the myth see Clytie turn into a sunflower, although the belief that the sunflower turns to face the sun is actually wrong. Interestingly, sunflowers represented haughtiness in the language of flowers, and that came from an 1867 flower dictionary. Elsewhere, it also represented ambition, constancy, devotion, loyalty, and unhappy love, and we can certainly see a lot of these ideas around the sunflower in the Clytie myth. Now, De Morgan paints Clytie at the point that she turns into a sunflower, and the flowers grow up around her as if they will overtake her entirely. Now, this painting also demonstrates De Morgan's tendency to take quite a popular myth and then rewrite it from a woman's perspective. And if we look at Frederick Leighton's version of the same myth painted 9 years later, his Clytie is subservient to Helios, on her knees begging for forgiveness. By comparison, De Morgan's Clytie shields her eyes from the sun instead of simply watching its path in mute and selfless devotion, as quoted by Smith. Now, the open water behind her reminds us of Clytie's true home, whereas in Leighton's painting, bright sunlight overwhelms the image, here putting more of an emphasis on Helios than Clytie. So it's quite interesting that De Morgan reversed this and put all the emphasis back on Clytie again. In 1894, De Morgan painted another flower-related mythological figure, but this time she chose the Roman goddess of flowers, and she puts Flora before a loquat tree since it flowers in the spring. And this then aligns Flora with spring, flowers and natural bounty, and the pose was actually inspired by Botticelli, and there is a certain degree of Botticelli's influence that we can see in De Morgan's work. Now notice that the focus is on Flora, but unlike paintings by artists like John William Waterhouse, she doesn't need to be nude. So instead, De Morgan dresses her in a simple billowing gown that reflects the drapery seen in classical sculptures. It also lets her show off her abilities in painting realistic fabric. De Morgan adds pansies to her dress, with the pansy representing thoughts in the language of flowers. Now also, Flora's long flowing red hair would normally be associated with loose women, as in the work of Waterhouse, yet here De Morgan uses Flora's hair to denote freedom and abundance, and also in some ways it does remind you of The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. There are few myths directly associated with Flora, and instead she sometimes appears as a supporting character in larger myths, so as a result, De Morgan paints her in quite a simple way, drawing reference to her function rather than specific legends. For Elise Lawton Smith, this painting combines pagan imagery with Christian symbolism. For example, the painting uses dawn and spring flowers as a sign of spiritual awakening. The swallows on Flora's scarf represent resurrection, while the goldfinches represent renewal via the Passion of the Christ. So it is quite interesting how she's taken this pagan figure, but still being able to find enough overlap between Flora's associations, but also the Christian symbolism that De Morgan was interested in. We see another dawn-related image in Eos of 1895, and this painting depicts the Greek goddess of the dawn. Unlike other goddesses, she is winged and pouring water from a jug, and this addition of a jug is a clever one because it reminds us of De Morgan's classical education. After all, the image of a figure pouring liquid is usually associated with Aquarius, the water carrier, and remember we did go into the Aquarius myth more widely way back in January when we looked at the air signs zodiac origin myths. In most versions of the Aquarius myth, it refers to Ganymede, that handsome youth beloved by Zeus. Yet there are also versions of the myth in which Eos actually loved Ganymede first, and Zeus basically stole Ganymede from Eos. So De Morgan uses the Aquarius reference as an allusion to these differing myths. The crescent moon behind her shows she has already brought the dawn, and now her sister, the moon goddess Selene, is at work. The rosy hue of Eos's wings reflect the colours of the sky at dawn, and we can see further folklore allusions through the flowers at her feet, because De Morgan has included what looks like daisies and white roses. Laura Valentine notes that white roses represented silence, while in the language of flowers, white roses meant I am worthy of you. Perhaps Eos wishes to tell us that she's worthy of our worship, or maybe it's a rebuke to Ganymede. Valentine also notes that the Greeks dedicated roses to the rosy-fingered goddess Aurora, and Aurora is the Roman name for Eos, goddess of the dawn, so it would make sense that if the Greeks were dedicating roses to her, that they would then be in the painting. In more recent sources, white roses mean charm, eternal love, humility, innocence, and virtue, and this meaning of eternal love could indeed refer to the curse placed on Eos by Aphrodite, that she would forever be in love with someone. Most of these attempts at finding love are usually thwarted. Daisies represented innocence, while wild daisies meant I will think of it, and if you slept with daisy root under your pillow, a lost lover would return. Given Eos's checkered past with romance, that could indeed refer to a number of past lovers. And De Morgan uses a similar composition to other paintings such as Flora and Eos in Helen of Troy from 1898, and I don't think this is an accident because De Morgan depicts Helen of Troy as if she were a goddess, and again I think this alludes to De Morgan's classical education, because in the myth of Leda and the Swan, we learn that Zeus adopted the form of a swan to seduce Leda, queen of Sparta. After returning to the palace, Leda also slept with her husband, King Tyndareus. later became pregnant and gave birth to 4 children. 2 of the children were Castor and Clytemnestra, and they were those of her husband. The other 2 were Helen and Pollux and were the children of Zeus, and if the names sound familiar, it's because Castor and Pollux go on to become the constellation Gemini, which again you can find in the Zodiac Air Signs episode. Yet here we see that Helen has divine parentage, so it makes sense that De Morgan would depict her as a goddess. She also chooses not to represent the Trojan War directly, perhaps reflecting her own pacifist stance around war. Helen is instead surrounded by doves and again white roses, and while doves traditionally represent peace, this stands at odds with the war that Helen apparently inspired. As with Eos, the white roses could imply her belief in her own worthiness. Now, the pink of her dress aligns her with Venus through the attribution of pink to the goddess of love, and there's also a figure of what looks like Venus on the back of Helen's mirror. These links with Venus reference popular versions of the Trojan War story, in which Aphrodite, the Greek version of Venus, promised Helen as a prize to Paris. So why did she do that? Well, we need to go back a little bit to a marriage banquet among the gods. Now, the gods didn't invite Eris, goddess of discord, to this marriage banquet, which understandably annoyed Eris, and basically they didn't invite her because, as goddess of discord, they didn't think that anyone would have the most fun time ever. So Eris took a golden apple from the garden of the Hesperides and threw it among the attendees, and in a newer version of the myth, she'd actually inscribed the words "for the fairest one" on the apple. Aphrodite, Athena and Hera all claimed the apple because they all believed they were the fairest one. And they appealed to Zeus to judge, and understandably he didn't want to choose, because how could he? Hera was his wife, Athena his favourite child, and Aphrodite was the goddess of beauty. How on earth could you possibly pick one of them without annoying the other 2? So he then passed the task on to Paris, who was immortal but seen as being exceptionally fair, and the goddesses all tried to bribe Paris with gifts. So Hera would make him king of Asia and Europe, Athena would give him wisdom and skill in war, while Aphrodite offered Helen the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris therefore chose Aphrodite, and in taking Helen, started the Trojan War. I'm sure Eris was delighted. But back to Evelyn De Morgan's painting. In choosing to include this image of Venus or Aphrodite on the mirror, she references the ultimate cause of the war. It also draws attention to Helen's face, since her beauty basically caused the war, and it's a very clever way to show the Trojan War without actually needing to dwell on the carnage caused. There's also a double allusion by also including the moon, which can represent femininity and changeability through its changing cycle throughout the month. And it also links to the moon card in the tarot, and here the moon often represents illusions and deception. After all, the moon appears to shine, although it's really just reflecting sunlight. So when we look at moonlight, we're looking at both a reflection and an illusion. Could De Morgan be making a comment that beauty is ultimately illusory, or did she just really enjoy mythology? I leave that one up to you to decide. Now we're going to end with probably one of De Morgan's most misunderstood paintings, but it's probably my favourite, and that's the Love Potion from 1903. And in it, a woman apparently brews a love potion. We only know that it's a love potion because that's the title of the painting, otherwise it would be completely impossible to know what it is that she's doing. We can also see a couple on a terrace embracing through the open window, and many commentators assume the woman clad in gold to be a witch and presume her to be trying to split up the couple, and they therefore point to the black cat at her feet as being her familiar. However, if you take a closer look at the books on the shelf beneath the window, you suddenly go, perhaps there's more going on here than meets the eye. For example, one book is by Paracelsus and another is by Agrippa, and the sorceress therefore appears more of an alchemist or an occult practitioner than a folk witch. Her rich dress and sumptuous decor would indeed support this reading. And another implication is that she's simply brewing a love potion for a client, so perhaps the happy couple on the terrace are actually a former success story. Indeed here, the man is dressed as a knight and the woman as a medieval lady, and this recalls ideas around chivalry and courtly romance. Now, Elise Lawton Smith describes this figure as being a magician and scholar rather than a witch or sorceress, and she also draws occult meaning from the colour palette used, with the focus being on black, white, red and yellow. These colours appear in alchemical systems to represent the progressive stages towards the ultimate attainment of spiritual illumination, and by dressing the magician in yellow, she is shown as being both at the height of her profession and also being at the highest stage of spiritual development. And I think this is perhaps my favourite interpretation because it grants so much authority and agency to the female figure, and she becomes the protagonist because she actually has a profession and a thing that she does that she's good at, rather than just simply being a woman to whom things have happened, which is sort of what you get with a lot of the other mythological paintings. And I think that's why I like the love potion, because it's not from a specific myth, so this woman can have a different kind of feel about her. Now, it is basically interesting to note that the central character in almost all of De Morgan's paintings is a woman, and in a way this is no different to John William Waterhouse, but the motivation for doing so is rather different, because for De Morgan, and I quote, "the female body was ripe with potentiality, serving as a model for social and spiritual transformation from constraint to freedom," end quote. Now, her largely clothed female figures do not reinforce traditionally Victorian gender roles, and in her mythological paintings their connection with nature is more important. And indeed, she started out with a full-length female nude for Cadmus and Harmonia in 1877 to compete with the male artists. But you do tend to find that the paintings where she's got nude women, they're not painted in a way so as to like titillate the viewer. It's like they're nude for a reason rather than just the fact that they're sort of standing there with one boob hanging out, which is what you often get with Waterhouse. But clearly there is so much more to De Morgan than these paintings that we've looked at today, because her spiritualist paintings depicting dark times and shining figures beset by monsters derive much symbolism from Christian allegories. But these obviously lie outside the bounds of folklore and mythology, and they're fascinating, but for me the mythological paintings are perhaps richer than those of her male counterparts at the time. She packs these paintings with classical references, but also uses floral motifs in a way that would speak to contemporary audiences who by that point would be well versed in the language of flowers. Now, De Morgan herself is also an interesting figure, rolling early feminism, spiritualism and artistic talent into her paintings, and in many ways they actually speak for her since she left so few of her own words, and yes, they do make a refreshing change within the somewhat formulaic works by her male counterparts. So that is the end of this week's episode, and I would love to know what you think of Evelyn De Morgan's work. Had you heard of her before this episode? Or is this the first time that you've ever really seen that many of her paintings? Or have you indeed seen one of her paintings before and just not realised it was hers? I would hazard a guess that if you've seen one of her paintings before, it'll be the Love Potion. One, because I've used it myself on a blog post. I think it was the Love Magic blog post. But also because you'll have seen it basically being used to illustrate potions and witchcraft and so on in a way that it possibly shouldn't be. But anyway, do feel free to let me know what you think of Evelyn De Morgan as an artist. Again, you can comment below if you're on YouTube, you can comment on the blog post, or you can tweet me or send me a message on Instagram, whatever's easier for you. Remember that Fabulous Folklore does have a Facebook page now, so you can always post comments there as well. Like I say, I hope you enjoyed that episode. We do have 2 more artists left. I'm not 100% sure which ones I'm doing yet because I need to research them a little bit further, but there will be 2 more for the rest of July. If you've got any requests for August, there's the requests form below where it literally says like drop your request here. It's just a Google form. Feel free to drop them there if there's anything you'd like to hear about in August. And other than that, I hope you have a lovely week ahead and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu and I hope that you have a safe travels wherever you're going on to next.